Really hateful towards creature decks. The creature base of Scavenging Ooze, Sylvan Caryatid, Courser Crewfix, Polychronos, Archangel Thune, and Obsidian is just an incredible roster of anti-beatdown creature cards. Game 1 against Revelation decks is a little tough. He doesn't have a lot of interaction, but post-board he gets to overload on a lot of removal, a lot of discard rather, and a lot of Underworld connections.
Yeah, he would have, this is a post-board game, so he would have in his deck at this point 2 Sin Collectors, 2 Duresses, 3 Mistcutter Hydras, up to 4 Underworld connections, a Golgari Charm to go with his 3 Abrupt Decays to destroy Detention Spheres. So yes, his deck becomes very, very hateful for a control strategy after board.
So Marshall up a game, not surprising.
And it looks like Underworld Connections is incoming, yeah. This is, again, not a card that he has any copies of in the main deck, but post-board, this is the plan A for Ryan.
So Marshall just with the Temple card in here, no way to remove the connections for the time being.
When I spoke with Reed, again, this is Reed's design originally at the Invitational, the way he explained the deck to me was he really, really, really wanted to play Abrupt Decay. And past that, it was just a process of figuring out the best shell to wrap around Abrupt Decay. The justification there was basically Abrupt Decay kills creatures in the matchups where you needed to kill creatures and kills Detention Spheres in matchups like this.
And Underworld Connections as well was another card he mentioned to me as being an important consideration for Abrupt Decay. Another thought sees here from Ryan, Doomblade, Kiora, 2 copies of Kiora, an Elspeth, and a 4th land.
Yeah, that backup Kiora is a pretty big deal for Marshall here. Kiora is, there are some matchups where it's pretty unreliable, and there are some matchups where it's fantastic. This, I think, is one of the latter. This junk mid-range deck, it has some threats, but not like a huge density of threats. And some of the threats that it has aren't actually meant to be attacking foremost. They're meant to be generating value, things like Courser of Crewfix. So being able to lock down, say, the 1 Polychronos or the 1 Archangel of Thune, if you can do that with Kiora, you aren't too worried about something like a Scavenging Ooze.
Mm-hmm. So Jace, Architect of Thought, the draw here for Marshall.
Now he gets to decide which Planeswalker he wants to play. I'm leaning toward Kiora on an empty board here, but he's going to go with the Jace.
I like casting Jason Minusing here.
Okay, just trying to get ahead. Start generating a little card advantage.
And Blind Obedience, the reveal here. I wonder if Marshall is very familiar with this list because that's a very specific card to be bringing in here. You would basically only be bringing in to fight over Mistcutter Hydra.
He may have seen Obsidian in game 1.
Sure.
And, yeah, Blind Obedience is a very good card against Obsidian, although it doesn't solve the Obsidian problem. It just kind of buys you a couple turns. Mm-hmm. So it's possible that he saw it. He might also just be assuming that any mid-range-ish deck with access to green mana is going to be bringing in some number of Mistcutter Hydras. I think that's a safe assumption. The real question is how heavily is he going to value that Blind Obedience?
Yeah, the split is Blind Obedience verse, and Marshall, without another land in his hand, takes the land in the Supreme Verdict.
Mm-hmm. Makes the land drop, and actually, did he?
Yeah, I believe
yeah,
that
I believe he. Yeah, okay, I was thinking about that.
Yeah.
This is his. Yeah, because he played the land untapped to cast the Jace.
Right. So we're going to be. I believe our spotter has identified this. He'll be intervening here momentarily, I believe. And there is a stop of the action. We're going to be coming back to the booth here while we get this resolved momentarily.
This is an easy thing to lose track of, honestly, when you're, particularly when you're playing effects like Jace, Architect of Thought, that kind of require you to manipulate a bunch of cards, weigh several pros and cons, and actually take just time, take upwards of a minute to resolve.
I think it's also challenging with the scry lands because you're used to this play pattern of, all right, draw a scry land. Okay, I can't do anything with it this turn, so I'm going to do X, Y, and Z, and then my last action of the turn is going to be playing a scry land.
Sure.
So when you have these lengthy turns where you're doing various things, then, all right, we were able to just pull the land back there, so no big deal. We're going to be moving back to Ryan's turn.
And we do actually see a Mistcutter Hydra there, so that Blind Obedience would have been, well, a turn too late, honestly, but there are certainly several copies of Mistcutter Hydra that Ryan has access to in his deck. So he's going to draw a card first. He can still Mistcutter the Jace away, just with the mana that he has available.
Yeah, he doesn't even need to play. He can actually play a Temple this turn and still kill if he was feeling so inclined.
Yeah, I don't love that play. Generally, I err on the side of trying to. This feels like an obvious statement, but this comes up more often than you'd think, where you can play a tap land and play a Mistcutter Hydra that is a decent enough size, or you can play an untapped land where you might actually want to sequence it so that you could play a 5-drop the next turn, or so that you could use your mana a little better in the future. But generally, I think it's worth it to just maximize the size of the Mistcutter.
And Ryan agrees. He's going to go ahead and make that Mistcutter Hydra a 3/3 and take down Jace.
Mistcutter Hydra significantly cannot be fogged by Kiora. So Marshall is going to be maybe a little bit pressed to find an answer to it. I believe he did have the Doomblade in hand, though, right? So,
yes.
Okay, so this Mistcutter, not a problem. Future Mistcutter certainly still could be. Looks like he is going to consider his options a little further. I think maybe he... Okay, so he has the Supreme Verdict now as well. So he has multiple ways to get this thing off the board, and he is just trying to decide which method he prefers.
He's going to go with Kiora.
Interesting.
Going to go ahead and minus Kiora.
Okay. So that allows him to make 2 land drops this turn. He's basically sacrificing his Kiora if he wants to. Well, that is what he's chosen, is not deal with this Mistcutter immediately, but gain the extra land drop and, in a sense, gain 3 life and force Ryan to spend his turn attacking the Kiora.
Yeah, and if he has Elspeth in hand, he needs to get these tapped lands out of his hand as well to be able to set up Elspeth for next turn.
Okay. So Ryan going to draw a card first off. This is the traditional play pattern for Underworld Connections. So checks his options, finds another Mistcutter. In this case, I don't like shipping it, like just sending the other Mistcutter out. He can sit on Advent of the Worm. Actually, can't currently cast it, but there it is. He can sit on Advent, he can cast Vraska. I think I like sitting on Advent here, and that's what Ryan's going to go with as well. Well.
Do you think there's an argument for casting Vraska when you're aware of Supreme Verdict in your opponent's hand?
Well, there is, but holding up Advent is actually also a fantastic answer to a Supreme Verdict that you know is there. And I don't like casting Vraska when there's not something of value to destroy with it immediately, because that exposes it to Detention Sphere, Hero's Downfall, things like that. Although, having seen Marshall's mana base, Ryan can probably safely assume there are no Hero's Downfalls.
We've seen some ambitious stuff on camera today. I don't know if you can totally rule that out.
That is fair. Yeah, actually, I guess once you see this many colors, you actually can't rule. Yeah, you cannot rule anything out.
So another Kiora, that's just going to be minused again.
Marshall's just milking these Kioras for a little bit of value then, rather than trying to stick one as a win condition. Which I suppose makes sense post-board when you have to consider the Mistcutter Hydra. I fully expected him to jam it on 4 and start taking it up to an ultimate. But having seen the way this game has played out a little more, I think the existence of Mistcutter Hydra makes that plan a little shady.
So Ryan is going to go ahead and deploy the Advent of the Worm token at the end of the turn.
So representing 8 damage total, which is not even a 2-turn clock. I think he has to commit at least one of his creatures to that Kiora, although he could actually destroy it with Vraska. There is now a target. So that doesn't cost him any damage. That lets him get a turn's worth of value out of Vraska. That would kind of backfire for him here because of the Elspeth that's sitting in Marshall's hand, although he can't necessarily rely on that.
There's a lot of stuff he has to play around right now.
Yeah, there is. Some of which he knows about, some of which he does not. And I don't think he knows about the Elspeths, right? He knows about Supreme Verdict and Doomblade. He saw that with the Thoughtseize, and he saw the Supreme Verdict from the Jace flip.
So here's an Abrupt Decay. That's going to take care of Mistcutter Hydra.
Okay, and it looks like the Mistcutter was going towards the Planeswalker. The Worm was going to Marshall's head. That's kind of the obvious attack. Abrupt Decay, one of those cards that he had to play around. Another one that he actually didn't know about.
Yeah, because he doesn't want to spend his turn attacking everything at Kiora there.
Yeah,
Kiora is pretty anemic, and, Marshall's on a 2-turn clock there, so it's really hard to spend your turn attacking, but...
Yeah, and I think now you have to play Vraska and get that Kiora off the board. Because if you allow Marshall a turn with the Kiora, then he fogs your Advent of the Worm, and then you have no pressure whatsoever. So doing it this way at least forces him to answer the Advent, whether it be by casting Supreme Verdict, leaving up Doomblade, or by playing Elspeth and ticking down. But either way, if you don't do that and actually let Marshall continue, or actually let Marshall lock down the worm, then you give him a window to play Elspeth and uptick it,
yeah.
And then you fall very far behind. You're basically spotting your opponent a turn by doing that.
So Marshall's trying to figure out how to proceed here. A lot of power in his hand, of course, behind the gun a little bit here because of that underwall connections.
So finds the Detention Sphere, answers the, okay. So he can answer the creature that way. I guess he is not concerned with the Vraska.
Well, he doesn't really care about the Detention Sphere getting blown up at this point because there's just an advent, so.
I guess that's fair. Yeah, in this matchup, again, knowing about Abrupt Decay, seeing Vraska now on board, having to assume that there are Golgari Charms after board, yeah, your Detention Spheres are very unreliable. So finding a target that you can't actually unlock from the Detention Sphere is probably worth like always going for that target when he could have gotten Vraska or Underworld Connections, which is Underworld Connections, I think, certainly the biggest problem on board.
So Marshall has had enough here. Not quite dead just yet, but time is certainly a factor for him, and I think he saw the writing on the wall here and just wants to go on to a third game.
Okay. Yeah, he had answers to that Mistcutter Hydra in hand, so he wasn't necessarily dead to it, but you're right, 15 minutes left on the clock, and this is not a deck that can necessarily win quickly, so he has to be conscious of that.
Yeah, I mean, the options he has to win the game here, in a sideboard, there's not a lot. If he's brought in the 2 copies of Blood Baron, that's one thing. He also has 4 copies of Centaur Healer, a Last Breath, a Pithy Needle, a Mutavault, a Blind Obedience, 2 Mistcutter Hydras, a Doom Blade, a Revoke Existence, and a Abrupt Decay. Time is definitely a factor for Marshall's deck. He cannot win the game that quickly. He's looking at essentially just going ultimate with Planeswalkers. That's his way to win.
Sure. Which is not that unreliable when you have this many Planeswalkers either, but is still, yeah, you have to be conscious of your threat density. You have to make sure that you can consistently find something that deals damage. Here's a weird question. If you're Marshall here, do you legitimately entertain bringing in Mistcutter Hydra, which is just a green fireball in this matchup?
I don't think you can. I think it's too bad. And you know that Ryan's got various heroes downfalls. I understand, trying to speed up the deck a little bit, but it feels like such a long shot that Ryan's going to be unable to handle that card.
Well, sort of, to some degree. This deck definitely does have ways to clear a board. Sweepers like Supreme Verdict, Elspeth, in a sense, is a sweeper in this matchup, and it definitely makes its land drops. So if you can get to a clean board, then you could just spit a 12-12 at them, too.
Yes.
So.
No, it's not. I'm not saying that I can't imagine a game where Mistcutter Hydra is good for Marshall. It's just, it feels like a long ball to me.
It does. Definitely feels like a long shot. This is kind of the way that I look at control decks, I guess. In a post-board game with a control deck, I want to be bringing in at least 6 creatures.
Yeah, most people are just cutting all their creature removal, and
yeah,
it can be definitely an effective and unexpected way to win, and often actually supplements your sweeper effects because people have to play in further to your board once you're developing it yourself.
But having said that, I understand that my approach to these decks is a little non-traditional. This is not necessarily my plan A. So I trust that someone like Marshall, who can bring this deck to bear in the first place, who can actually conjure up 4-color control, has put enough thought into it and has enough of a background in this strategy that he knows whether or not that kind of sideboarding technique is right for him.
Right. Let's see here, take a mulligan. Seen Jeff Hooglin, we had him on camera earlier, his 4-color control deck, some issues with mulligans, just the mana base is not quite stable enough. Looked like Marshall did have a hand there of lands and spells, but just not enough castable stuff.
Yeah, and it's one of those things where most players, I think, don't take enough lands and spells mulligans. They think if they're like, well, I have some lands and I have some spells, we're good. That's all they look at. But certain decks are like, you never want to take those. It's the kind of thing where, like, sometimes it's correct to take one of those mulligans, as it may have been in this case for Marshall, but anytime you have to do it, you just feel miserable about it.
Yeah.
So a deck like this that opens up that possibility, that's kind of a feel-bad scenario for Marshall, and maybe something that he's reconsidering here.
But you got to have the discipline to lay down those kind of hands if they're not functional here. See Marshall get things started off here. Temple of Enlightenment, now a Temple of Deceit.
Yeah, those temples, those are absolutely the glue that holds the style of deck together.
Yeah, you're in the market for mana fixing. You don't mind if your lands come to play tap because you don't have much to do early on. And of course, scrying just super powerful.
Yeah, well, actually, the Temple's the glue that holds both of these decks together, for that matter.
Yeah.
Although Ryan does not get to scry on his second turn, only his first.
A third scry land here for Marshall.
And Ryan, we see an Underworld Connections in his hand. That's likely going to be the first significant play of the game. Unless he decides that he would like to present something else just to draw out something like Syncopate or Negate. If you're Ryan and you have access to something like a Sin Collector here, you might prefer to lead with that. But no, he's just going to go with Underworld Connections.
So we'll see here. This was the card that buried Marshall in game 2. We'll see if he's able to put an answer together for it.
He does have the Tension Sphere in hand. Actually, and Abrupt Decay, it looked like.
Yeah, with a Breeding Pool, so he can cast everything here.
Let's start with the Tension Sphere. Now that opens up a possibility in the future for Ryan to destroy their Tension Sphere, get his Underworld Connections back, and on turn 3, when he tapped out for Underworld Connections, he didn't get a chance to use it before it was exiled, but going forward, any answer to the Detention Sphere is basically a cantrip for Ryan because he's going to be able to stick his Underworld Connections back on an untapped land, as we see him doing right now.
Yep. It's possible that Marshall wants to hold his Abrupt Decay for Mistcutter Hydra. That's the reason to take that line, but
sure.
Certainly getting punished here as the Underworld Connections is now unlocked.
Yeah, and you're probably right. I think Mistcutter is a significant enough problem that you need to address it. Although Marshall does have access to Far and Away as well, so he has some other answers to Mistcutter Hydra. Far and Away is a little less reliable, though.
Yeah.
So Marshall basically just showing some discipline, holding the Abrupt Decay, we think. But
so Marshall with a $10,000 Mutavault and a Blood Baron of Vizkopa.
10,000, really? Is that where we are now?
I don't think it's pretty expensive.
Okay. I've always been very bad at keeping track of what cards are worth. I know that I've seen those in play and had people kind of oogle them, but yeah. I am oogling this Blood Baron of Vizkopa right now because it is a very big play at the moment.
Yeah, not a ton of answers in the Jund deck for this card.
Yeah, Ryan, after board, looks like he has the two Elspeths that he had in his main. Those are the only answers actually in his main deck. And then after board, he gains no others. So yeah, just 2 Elspeth as a potential solution here, which I believe I did see one in his hand, actually.
And Palakranos is not a bad answer either, assuming that you can defend it.
Okay, sure, yeah. Palakranos not an answer exactly, but a significant roadblock.
Right. So that Thoughtseize goes ahead and takes his Sphinx's Revelation.
And Ryan now with 4 mana up to commit a threat of some sort, one would hope for him. And there comes the Palakranos, as you said.
So Ryan going to cross his fingers here and hope his Palakranos gets to survive the next turn.
He knows that Marshall needs help from the top of his deck.
The draw was Supreme Verdict.
That does answer the Palakranos, but not necessarily in the way that Marshall would have intended.
Yeah, now that Marshall doesn't have his Sphinx's Revelation anymore, it's not clear he can kind of take that road.
Now, as long as this Blood Baron's in play, though, and okay, it looks like Marshall does actually get a chance to answer that Underworld Connections after all. But as long as Blood Baron is in play, I think Ryan is in a position where he can't afford to attack with his Palakranos. So Marshall might not necessarily dislike this spot.
It's a staring contest of sorts. Marshall still has Sphinx's Revelation as a big draw, potentially Elspeth as well. So he's in a bit of a holding pattern, but he's got some tools to work with. Yeah,
Marshall can, in essence, miracle a Sphinx's Revelation at any point once the game reaches this stage. Ryan, on the other hand, can continue to draw must-answer cards like Underworld Connections or this Elspeth. And actually, at this point, he gets to choose between the two.
Yeah, a lot of tools to work with himself. He's going to play a Temple Garden untapped, fall to 13, deploys Elspeth.
So now it's Ryan who doesn't mind the staring contest at all. Marshall didn't mind it for deck construction reasons. You know, his deck was a little better suited to play a draw-go contest here. But now with this Elspeth in play, Marshall has, 3 turns to find an answer? Or the ultimate just kills him?
Yep.
He does have the Supreme Verdict, so he can kind of reset the clock at that point, but not in a significant way. Like, the Elspeth is still going to kill him on its own unless he finds a real solution to it.
And you can see how the matchup flips a lot in the post-board games. Having access to underworld connections really changes the way that the junk mid-range deck gets to pilot the game.
Yeah, these control decks, like Sphinx's Revelation decks in general, they are built with the assumption that they will see more cards over the course of the game than their opponent. But once a deck can actually bring in 4 underworld connections and protect it by destroying detention spheres and things like that, then you flip the script completely. If you look at more cards than your Sphinx's Revelation opponent, you're in great shape.
Yeah, you still have to worry about winning the game quickly enough to not get overwhelmed by something like a random Aetherling or Elspeth, but you definitely can flip the script, as you said, on the way that you pace the game. So here's another Underworld Connections for Ryan.
Ryan's going to go right back to drawing cards, it looks like. Sitting on several double black spells, but only 2 black sources, so he's bottlenecked a little bit there.
Finds a Swamp.
So that might go some of the distance. If he finds another black card in his next, black source in his next 2 turns, then he starts to, he gains the opportunity to be a little more aggressive with his answers. Although he doesn't actually have a target for those heroes' downfalls, so it's not especially urgent.
So Marshall kept the card on top of his deck last turn with his Scry. I'm curious to see what it is. I
doubt it was the Blind Obedience. That doesn't seem like a card that is worth keeping in this situation.
It feels like the game has moved past that point.
Yeah. Now it's possible that if he may be thinking that he has the Supreme Verdict, which he expects to have to use next turn if he doesn't find an answer to Elspeth. Once he Supreme Verdicts away the board, he might want some insulation against a big Mistcutter Hydra.
Sure. So Ryan going to draw another card off his connections.
Is that a... there was some kind of promo card tucked away behind that Polychronos that I don't recognize. Oh, that's the F&M Sin Collector. Okay. It looked like a Notion Thief, and I was like, are we Notion Thiefing here? Can he cast that? What's going on here? I got a little excited. I get excited by Notion Thieves, but that in fact is not one. That is a Sin Collector.
So we'll see momentarily what's left over in Marshall's hand is Supreme Verdict.
Ouch. So that probably throws a big brick in Marshall Arthur's game plan. Because I think he was leaning on that sweeper to buy him the turns that he needed.
Yeah, absolutely. And now Marshall looking at lethal next turn here with that Elspeth ultimate. He needs a big draw.
What is it? What is it? He's going to slow roll us as well as Ryan.
And there's a concession.
Okay.
Marshall Arthur's loses game 3 to Ryan Gerhart. Junk mid-range, Reed-Duke's brainchild, now 6-1. We didn't get to see game 1. Generally speaking, poor for the junk mid-range deck. A lot of kind of inefficient threats, assuming that your opponent doesn't